If you have ever taken a Western civilization class or majored in philosophy or even just watched the movie 300, you're probably familiar with the name Socrates. However, what if I told you that Socrates is actually not the one who truly shaped Western thought, but instead his student Plato? Let me explain my thinking. To better understand this topic, we first need to discuss what exactly makes an idea Western. To answer that question, we'll be using a passage from the Republic by Plato himself. In this excerpt, Plato has Socrates describing the three key traits of something being Western. And those traits are: it must be about the soul, it must be concerned with justice, and it must include a reverence for the divine. So we're going to be using these three things as the basis for our discussion today. Now, when most people think of Socrates, they usually think of a man who is widely considered to be the father of Western philosophy. He's remembered as a great thinker, and for his defense at trial, and for his death by drinking poison. But sadly, we have no written works by Socrates. Everything we know about him comes from his students. And the biggest problem with that is that through their writings, he's always presented as the wisest person in the room, which creates a bit of a problem when we're trying to figure out where Socrates ends and where his students begin. Plato was indeed a student of Socrates, but he was also his literary biographer, and therefore had complete control over how Socrates was portrayed in his writings. We can see this especially clearly in Plato's dialogue called the Apology, which is a record of Socrates' last trial. Scholars generally agree that Plato whitewashed Socrates in this dialogue, making him come off much more noble than he really was. There are parts of the dialogue where you can tell that Plato is adding extra things to make Socrates seem wiser, like when Socrates predicts that someone will come to Athens from the region of Perea and speak falsely against Socrates, and then accuses that very person of doing so. Or when Socrates says that the only thing that fear is not good for is fear itself, which is a play on the common saying that only the good is worth fearing. So if we want to get a more accurate picture of who Socrates really was, we need to look beyond Plato's writing and instead turn to Xenophon. Now, unlike Plato, Xenophon wasn't a philosopher, but rather a historian and soldier. He was there during the Peloponnesian War and served alongside Cyrus the Great in his campaign against the Assyrians. His writings about Socrates are considered to be much less flattering than Plato's, though it should be noted that Xenophon wrote 6 dialogues about Socrates while Plato wrote 8. In addition to the evidence from Xenophon, we also have some historical facts about Socrates that don't reflect well on him. For example, Socrates was too poor to purchase his freedom from slavery and even refused to pay a fine levied against him. Because of his actions, many Athenians saw him as a troublemaker and a public nuisance. And so when he went on trial for corrupting the youth and for impiety, the jury found him guilty and he was sentenced to death. Instead of accepting his punishment, he escaped to Thessaly, where he lived the rest of his life as a mercenary soldier. So now that we know that Socrates was far from perfect, let's return to Plato's definition of Western thought. Remember, it must be about the soul, it must be concerned with justice, and it must include a reverence for the divine. Let's first examine the soul. One of the most important things to note here is that neither Socrates nor Plato believed the soul to be immortal. They both believed that after a person died, their soul would simply cease to exist. This completely goes against the idea of the soul being immortal, which was common throughout the rest of ancient Greece. However, they did believe that the soul could be divided into 2 parts, and that's because they viewed humans as being inherently conflicted creatures. According to them, we constantly battle between what is right and what is wrong, between wisdom and ignorance, and between courage and cowardice. These internal struggles were exemplified in the allegory of the charioteer, which comes from Plato's Phaedrus dialogue. In this story, Socrates uses a chariot as a metaphor for the human soul. The charioteer represents the rational part of the soul, and he drives 2 horses, one that's noble and one that's unruly. Just like a charioteer must constantly direct his horses towards the truth, we too must constantly try to bring our lower self under the control of reason. Now, that might sound like a very pessimistic view of humanity, but for Socrates and Plato, they actually thought it was quite optimistic. And that's because they believed that we were capable of striving for wisdom and goodness. We may not be immortal, but we do have the ability to make ourselves better. We can learn from our mistakes and grow intellectually and morally. In fact, Socrates was such a great believer in this that he even said, "I know that I know nothing." By saying that, he wasn't implying that he actually knew nothing. Instead, he was saying that since there is always more to learn, we should never stop questioning and seeking wisdom. Next, let's take a look at the concept of justice. According to Socrates and Plato, justice isn't merely following the laws of the state. Rather, it comes from each individual doing their duty based on their capabilities. This idea was explored in detail in Plato's dialogue called The Republic, which contains the famous allegory of the cave. In this story, prisoners have been chained up in a cave since birth and can only face a wall behind them. Behind the prisoners is a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners are puppeteers who are manipulating objects that cast shadows on the wall. All the prisoners have ever seen are these shadows, and so they believe them to be real. However, one prisoner escapes, and after adjusting to the sunlight outside the cave, he realizes that the shadows weren't real at all. Instead, they were created by the fire and the objects being manipulated by the puppeteers. The escaped prisoner then returns to the cave to share his knowledge with the others, but they end up killing him for it. This allegory is an extended metaphor for the process of becoming wise. The prisoners represent the average person, the cave represents the world of appearances, and the outside world represents the world of forms. Forms are the highest level of reality according to Plato, and they're eternal, unchanging, and perfect. Justice is one of those forms, and it exists outside of our perception. It's what is real, not the shadows on the wall. Plato believed that the philosopher's job was to escape the cave and reach the world of forms so that they could better understand what is true and then share that knowledge with others. Though unfortunately, like the escaped prisoner in the allegory, they'll likely be persecuted for doing so. Finally, let's consider Plato's reverence for the divine. Plato wasn't a monotheist, but he did believe in a higher power. And unlike the other pre-Socratic philosophers, he didn't attempt to explain the world through natural means alone. Instead, he acknowledged that there were some things that were beyond our understanding and needed a divine explanation. In addition to this, Plato believed that the philosopher's goal was to become closer to God. In his dialogue, Theaetetus, Plato writes, "The unexamined life is not worth living," but later adds that the examined life that causes one to love and seek wisdom and pursue the divine is worthwhile. Overall, Socrates and Plato had a massive influence on Western thought and culture, and they deserve much of the praise they receive. However, we shouldn't forget that Socrates was a flawed human being and that Plato used him as a mouthpiece for his own ideas. When discussing them, it's important to keep that in mind. If we forget that, we risk making them into false gods, which is ironically something that Socrates warned against. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that thumbs up button below. And if you want to watch more content like this, subscribe and check out the series in the description. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.